Well, U.S. President Joe Biden has told G7 leaders the U.S. was on track to complete its withdrawal by the August 31st deadline, despite the call for a delay to evacuate more people. At the same time, the Taliban said in their second press conference that they will not allow Afghanistan to be used for terrorism. As the world still tries to figure out how and has Taliban changed, a lot is at uncertainty as what a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan look like and how big powers will handle their relationship with the Taliban government in Kabul. To explore further the Afghan crisis, I'm joined today by Huang Jing, Dean of the Institution of International and Regional Studies at the Beijing Language and Culture University, Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University, and Zmarilai Abusin, CGTN correspondent in Kabul. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. We'll start with Zmarilai here. You are in Kabul. Obviously, there's a second press conference by Taliban, and the spokesperson said that the Taliban are blocking Afghans to enter the airport in Kabul. And why the sudden change? Why such a decision? What are reasons given by the Taliban?
Well, hello, Shando. The situation looks like other days, and we haven't received any report about that they've been blocking them. The day that the Taliban were appointing is after August 31st. And people are still striving to the airport, and there are thousands more coming to Kabul from different provinces. And as I've been in touch with some of them, they are just searching for any possible website, email, and they're sending their resumes, their documents, their passports, and everything to make it happen and finally reach Kabul airport, while there are lots of planes from the United States of America and the allies country and Kabul airport, and the situation still remains the same. Thousands are inside stuck, and crowds and thousands more in different parts of Kabul city, whether the foreign missions, embassies are closed, but there are hundreds of people in front of every mission, and they've been changing every hour.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the same time, at the conference, the Taliban has vowed there will be consequences if any U.S. troops remain after the deadline at the end of this month. What kind of consequences they are talking about? Do we have any idea?
Well, since the intra-Afghan negotiation were stalled, and that was a loss of time. But when we get back to 2018, when in December of the same year, U.S. and Taliban start talks in Doha, they've been working on every single aspect, and one of those problematic issues were the evacuation and withdrawal issue. And it's finally they reached the agreement on 29th of February 2020, and it stated that May 1st would be the last day of the United States and other allied forces in Afghanistan. And when Biden came to the White House, he said that we will be observing things, because that was also a sudden change after the election in the U.S. And it took time. Finally, they said we will withdraw on 11th of September. Then Joe Biden came with his statement that we will withdraw at 31st of August. That's why the Taliban say it was a one-sided decision. They've been talking with U.S. Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad on this regard, and finally they said we will wait for this, but other conditions were put on the table, and that's why the Taliban are now in Kabul and all around the country, and they say there is no issue, no talk about 31st of August. Though the consequences, we have to wait, but some believe that it's a smooth thing, and the Taliban may have a deal with about it, whether if it takes a week or two later. But we have to wait about the consequences. It doesn't seem that the Taliban will attack those forces in Kabul airport. Still, we have to wait.
Obviously, CIA Director William Burns and the Taliban Deputy Leader Abdul Ghani Barada has a secret talk. So do we have any idea what's it about?
Well, these issues are a little bit complicated, and when Bush joined a meeting with Mullah Abdul Ghani brother in Kabul, and that was the Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid didn't reject it, and he said he is not aware of the issues or these meetings, but many believe, and the sources told that he was here, and they've been talking about different issues regarding, including the evacuation process and also their political and diplomatic mission in U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and those agreements and pledges that Taliban and the U.S. have have made since last 2 years now. So these are all the issues, and Taliban is now on the political stage. It's much more difficult to just attack the checkpoints and army bases and others, and political issues, as everybody know better, demands more focus, more potential, and more maturity in this regard. And the Taliban are so new to control everything, and they have to start from zero to it goes on to the end. And that's all the related issues that U.S. is involved with. More than $9 billion of Afghanistan central banks are freezed, and banks are closed, and it's related to and interconnected to region and the world. So these are all the issues that might have been talked between the sides.
Well, the Taliban has also gave reassurances that the foreign embassies and aid agencies would remain open. You know, there's amnesty. There's no revenge against those people working for the former governments. So Wednesday, the bank will be open, etc. And there's a spokesperson even tweeted a short video clip saying that it's time to roll up sleeves and build the nation. I want to have the opinions of our panelists here. Huang Jing, I will start with you. So what's your impression of Taliban? Has Taliban changed?
Obviously, this time the Taliban authorities much more sophisticated. They know how to communicate with international community. They know that they have to respect the basic human rights. They also know that reconciliation is much more important in the rebuild of Afghanistan as a nation state. So they are more sophisticated. I think they are different, but whether they can keep this, what they said so far, is still wait to see. But compared to 20 years ago, this is a very different Taliban. The Taliban are more friendly, more open up to the outside world, and more skillful and sophisticated in communication with the outside world.
So
it's
Pavel,
a good sign.
Yeah, Pavel, in Moscow, are those changes, the right words said by the Taliban, are they just the cosmetic changes, but their nature remains unchanged or still being radical?
Well, really, no one knows for sure. The Taliban is, of course, primarily an ideological movement. They are united by their belief that building a society based on Sharia law is the right way to go forward in the modern world. They can also be kind of more tolerant and stretch the rules, but no one in the Taliban leadership can actually go against Sharia, because that will mean that he is going against the grain of the movement, and that may break up the movement into parts, into warring fractions, and no one wants that. So that means their regime they're going to build is going to be basically Sharia. That means you can't have non-Islamic banking, you can't pay interest. There's a lot of different things which they cannot really retreat from. Maybe they will not implement Sharia as brutally as they did when they were in power in the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. But anyway, they are a religious fundamentalist movement, and they cannot change that, because that helped them win the war. And that will have to be there. It's their backbone. They can't refuse that. And that means they are religious Orthodox fanatics in the last resort.
Well, Zmayalai, I want to have your impression because you are physically close to the Taliban, the soldiers, the people over there. What's your impression? Have they changed by nature?
Well, it's hard to say the Taliban have changed because you will see several categories here. The Taliban leadership, which I've already met in 2019-20, and I've been talking and interviewing them, and I had personal chats and discussions with them. They are totally changed. They know the world, they know the affairs, how to be maintained, and they know everything about Afghanistan. When it comes to the Taliban movement, they are now reaching the age of Taliban movement is now almost 30 years. They have fought, they have had discussions, the diplomacies, and now they're holding the power once more. When they took Kabul in 1996, Kabul was ruined. All the country, it was just empty. Nobody had that much education, And those last 20 years, millions of youth are educated now. The society has changed, the technology, the media, the freedom of speech, and I've been in this society. But the Taliban, who have been the fighters, they have been in mountains, they have been facing a lot of difficulties, the bombardments, the other forces that they have been facing, and they were just attacking everywhere, and that's what it will be difficult. Yesterday, when a Taliban spokesperson was talking about the women's joining offices again, he said, we told the women to stay home till everything become normal because we are afraid. He was appointing in different words, though. We are afraid of our own armed men because they are not familiar with the society yet. They are not well trained, and it will take time. So there is a difference. They're youth, they're armed men, they are extreme towards things. But the leadership, they know everything. And the positive point about Taliban that we have been seeing since last 10 days, they accept all the orders and guidance from their leadership. So it seems that Taliban are doing their best to make that beliefs and trust among the society and the region and the world, because there are much more obligations that the Taliban have to carry on, and they have a lot of homework to do.
Indeed. Well, Professor Mahoney, at the same time Tuesday, there's a G7 conference. Obviously, despite the plea from the European allies, President Joe Biden decided to go ahead and stick with the withdrawal deadline at the end of this month. So what are the reasons behind his decision?
I think the biggest reason is that it's very clear that once this deal was essentially negotiated by Trump, it really shifted the situation on the ground and led precisely to the strategic outcomes that we've observed, that the United States position militarily was declining unless they were to reverse course and pour a lot more troops and resources in, which was politically impossible at this point in time, given the lack of domestic support and Biden's own commitment to come out. So I think that this is, this plus the fact that where we are now, that while the United States still has considerable leverage, the Taliban also have considerable leverage, and there's a need to draw a line and move forward and not to extend further.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are complaints about this withdrawal or the handling of the withdrawal, and also complaints about the U.S. refusal to extend the withdrawal date, for example, deadline, from the European countries. Do you think the Biden administration gave any thought about that, or the concern from the European allies?
I think that the biggest blame that we can find with Biden is that for whatever reason, whether they anticipated this result, and it's clear from reports that that the intelligence community was warning him of that this might be a possible outcome, that he's shown at least on the front end some indifference to this type of consequence, and was not, it seems, very well prepared for the worst of it, and has only really begun to respond, I think, much more aggressively, given the incredible horror that a lot of Americans and Westerners have at how fast things have degraded. That said, I really don't think he's in position to do much more than trying to accelerate the evacuation, the mobilization of private airlines and these sorts of things that we've already seen.
Right. Pavel, if you listen to the Europeans, in particular, their complaints, there is, of course, with the plea for postponing the deadline being rejected by Biden. So General Claudio Graziano, the president of the EU Military Committee and ex-chief of the Italian Defense Staff, said of the withdrawal, quote, "This is a defeat of the whole West and of what we believe in over the last 20 years. It is certainly not the end of NATO, but it is clear the alliance must be rethought." So the alliance must be rethought, but in what way? What does it mean?
I think that's mostly an emotional response, or a military person. Maybe he has experience in Afghanistan, as many Europeans. I met Dutch generals. I met Danish generals that were fighting in Guillemette province. With war experience. Denmark wasn't really at war for a very long time. And so for them it's emotional that they sacrificed. They saw friends being wounded or even killed. And now it turns out that this was all a mistake, and the West, America, NATO is leaving Afghanistan to the same Taliban and shutting the door. But that's the nature of politics, and they'll get over it. NATO was created not to fight in Afghanistan, and losing Afghanistan will not end NATO. There will be hard feelings, but hard feelings go away when there's common interest, and there is common interest between Europeans and Americans. So I don't think that this... in Russia, the president of Belarus, who's yesterday had there was a virtual conference of the ODKB, the Russian-led defense alliance, about Afghanistan, and later he told journalists that we should not be so happy about the Western defeat in Afghanistan. Maybe this is all just a conspiracy, and the Americans and the Talibs are in cahoots, and they are just doing this, Americans, to make problems for Russia. So there are different opinions right now, very different opinions. But the fact is on the ground that the Americans are out, and that's the end of their presence in this country.
Well, Huang Jing, here is a related issue. Here there's some have complained that Biden's willingness to show that a Democrat administration is just as likely to act arbitrarily as a Republican one strengthens the case of President Macron of France that Europe needs to be more self-reliant and independent of Washington in foreign policy making. What do you make of that? That kind of seems to be a damage in terms of the Atlantic relationship, but how long that will last?
I would argue a little bit differently. I think that what really makes NATO member countries like Italy and Germany and the British, what makes them really frustrated is not the way the withdrawal is handled. It's poorly executed, no problem about that. But they're frustrated because the decision to withdraw is unilaterally made without a consultation of the ally in the first place. Because if we all go, the allies with Americans, they all came in as allies. So the withdrawal should be first discussed among the allies so that they would have a little bit coordination or understanding of the actions being taken. But because the Biden administration has done this unilaterally without consulting the allies, and in execution of this decision, also the United States has done it unilaterally without really coordinating with other allies. So left the allied countries all in dark. When the collapse of Afghanistan situation took place, the other allied countries like Germans, British, Italians, they're all in dark. They don't know what to do, and the United States seems to only care about itself, its own interests. That's where the frustration comes in. I think that has done a great damage to NATO. I do not think it's just emotional. I think there are a lot of reasons behind it. But going back to your question about the Democratic government cannot make a decision like that. I don't think that's the case. I think this shows three things. Number one, that the decision is made, like I said, without a kind of, careful consideration of the consequence. But what even worse, makes sense even more worse, is that the execution is very bad. Not just among allies, but just within Biden administrations. I don't think the different government agencies, the different institutions has really coordinated with each other, even communicate with each other very well. We can see a lot of report about this kind of bickering and arguing between the intelligence community and the army, and between State Department and the Pentagon, so forth. So internal coordination and the mechanism of internal coordination is totally collapsed. Last but not the least is that the reaction to the situation is so slow, so sloppy. Just a few days before the total collapse of Afghanistan government, we have top officials, including President Biden himself, still tells the people, guarantees that no, this will not happen. We're doing very well. So all of this has shown a kind of, I think, some serious problems for the Biden administration in this.
Mm-hmm. Speak of the problems for the Biden administration. Professor Mahoney, the Biden administration has talked a lot about the priorities of the foreign policy. It's about the human rights, it's about the values, it's about the democracy. But now he's talking about the U.S. interest in Afghanistan is only about fighting the terrorism, and it is done. So time to go home. How can he reconcile the two different kind of goals?
I think this is a big question, and we saw this coming out of this issue raised, I think it was yesterday, by the Chinese envoy to the UN about whether or not the United States would reflect on its own human rights abuses in Afghanistan. The fact that since the U.S. invasion, we've seen a couple 100,000 deaths, and in hindsight, given the failure there, but also given the response that we saw after 9/11, that it seems extreme, both extreme in terms of its response and extreme in terms of its failure. And I think to still focus on terrorism without sort of thinking about, above all, how the U.S. mismanagement of the invasion actually prompted the insurgency that we now see reaching its climax. All of these are very provocative issues that raise a lot of questions about whether or not the U.S. has learned lessons and whether or not the world can count on the U.S. to move forward in a more rational and peaceful manner as time moves forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pavel, in Moscow, here, German Chancellor Merkel visited Moscow and spoke to President Putin. She basically asked the assistance of Moscow, Russia, to help basically extend the deadline, to give more time to do the evacuation work. So it shows, like some people would say, the potential of a big role to be played by Russia in the Afghan situation. What do you make of that?
Well, for Russia, this is a very important issue. Afghanistan, the Americans can just basically go. And there on the other side of the world, they can think maybe there could be some kind of terrorist attack with some kind of origins in Afghanistan. But anyway, but in all other respects, Afghanistan is not their problem, but it's Russian problem very much, because there's, to the north of Afghanistan are the former Soviet Central Asian republics that are inherently unstable, and where there are pockets of very serious kind of people and populations who would maybe very much like a return to Sharia law, which would be inspired by what's happened, by the victory of Taliban in Afghanistan, and could get some help from there. And an insurgency could spread out to the north, and for Russia that would be a catastrophic event, because there's for Russia there's strategic assets, their economic assets, and for China, of course, and for the entire region, an insurgency spreading out of Afghanistan to the north would be a catastrophic event, not for the United States. So for Russia, this is very important. Russia says it's not going to go into Afghanistan. We kind of imply that Afghanistan has a negative strategic value. Those who go in spend a lot and get less than they spend to a large extent. But Russia was going to do its best to keep the border to prevent insurgency, talking to the Taliban, but at the same time saying that maybe we could even use force against the Talibans in Afghanistan if they become a threat. So that's kind of the Russian policy. And it was announced today that Russia began its own evacuation from Kabul of about 500 Russians. Several planes will be taking them out, taking the opportunity while the Americans are still controlling the Afghan international airport. So Russia right now is looking to see, as almost all the other world, what will the Talibans do after the Americans are finally gone, when they have the country and try to rule it, and what will happen next, and what, and especially importantly, what will be the consequences for the entire region.
So the security interests. So Huang Jing, obviously another player is China, which is neighbor of Afghanistan. One of the neighbors, China has a lot of interests. China has been calling for the international community to encourage and support the Taliban, to build an inclusive government, to focus on, building the nation. What are the Chinese interests? What China can do to help?
Of course, Afghan is very close to China, and also we know the history that the Taliban has once supported the Eastern Turkey organization, which has doing some terrorist acts in China. So, of course, like Russia, like all the countries around Afghan, because the United States has left such a mess over there, and the instability and the chaotic situation foster extremist forces which can do damage to all the countries and regions around Afghanistan. That's a major concern. So I think China's interest, first and foremost, is try to help to stabilize the situation, to restore order and stability. And upon that, I think the very urgent problem and challenge to all the people around Afghan, of course, Afghanistan themselves, is how to feed 40 million people, how to get the economy going. We know that if we have stability on the one hand, on the other hand, we have economic development, that's the best way to constrain terrorism, because instability and underdevelopment or chaotic situation is the best way to provoke terrorism. So China's interest there, of course, is working with other nation states who have an interest involved in Afghan affairs, like I said, to restore order first, and then to keep economy going, so that to constrain the kind of instability in Afghanistan. That's a first thing to do. Of course, the last thing China wants to do is to learn from United States to engage force in Afghanistan. That's the last thing China wants to do.
So very briefly, Ismail, what's your expectation of what China can do, most people to say economically, to help Afghanistan?
Yes, I think first and foremost,
Ismail,
main
please.
challenge. That's
Oh yeah, okay.
Ismail, go ahead.
Sorry. That's Shandu, the main challenge, the discussion of the day, because we have got no information since last few days about the casualties and the clashes, offensive, and those things that Afghanistan has is used to be since last 20 years at least, and now fully more than 43 years. That was another year. We have already, Afghanistan have already entered the new era, new phase of Afghanistan, where the Taliban try their best to change and to make friends with all Afghans, as they say, whether it's a political issue or whatever, but we have seeing a lot of signs about this. Whether the situation on the economic side, it's really challenging, not for not only for the Afghans, but for the Taliban administration.
It requires to be stable and peaceful. So many thanks to our guests, Ismail, Pavel, Huang Jing, and Professor Mahoney. And also thank you for watching. See you next time.